Hello class, welcome back. I hope everyone's doing well. This is going to be our topic of the week, or the start of one is photosynthesis. So let's get started with just some review of chemical reactions and bonds. I think this is really important to help us understand what photosynthesis is to understand maybe some of the chemistry and just how that works. So some ideas of chemical equations, or this idea is called balancing reaction. So a chemical reaction is like a math equation. So everything on the left side has to equal everything on the right. So for example, we have CO2, H2O, CO2, H2O, C6, H12, C6, and O2. So when we're talking about balancing everything, each one of these letters is a different element when we write them out like this. So this would be a carbon and a carbon. So we have one carbon on the right side and one carbon on the, we have a carbon on the right side and a carbon on the left. But these little subscripts tell us how many of each element we have in the overall compound. So when we have a group of them bonded together, it's called a compound. It's called a compound. So we have four different compounds here. We have carbon dioxide, water is H2O, this is sugar, and oxygen. So what this is telling us is that on our left side we have a carbon, but if we don't have a subscript, it means we just have one. So we have one carbon element, and on this side we have 6. On our left side we have 2 hydrogens and 12 hydrogens on our right. On our left we would have 1, 2, 3 oxygens, and on our right we'd have 6 plus 2 for 8. So because it's not balanced, we have to put in some numbers in the front. So we have numbers in the front, so now if we look at this, we would multiply this 6 by the little subscript. So if we look at carbons, we would have 1 times 6, so 6 carbons on this side and 6 carbons on this side. When we look at, let's do oxygen, we would have 6 times 2, so 12, and then another 6 because we have a 6 times a 1 and our oxygen to get 18. And then on this side we have 6, and then 6 times 2 is 12 to get 18 as well. And our last one is our hydrogen. We have 12 hydrogen over here, and then 6 times 2 for 12. So we had to balance our equation, so we had the right amount of elements on each. The other idea that I want to discuss is bonds. So bonds are potential energy, stored energy. So a bond happens between two elements that come together. And any time that bond is created, it takes energy to get made. Anytime it is broken, you release energy. So it's a lot like the way that our food is stored in our bodies. So when we eat, we are eating different food, different materials that gets stored as fat if we don't use it. And then maybe when we don't have as much food on a daily basis, maybe we go a day or two without eating, we start to use our fat that was stored from earlier. So it's also like a battery. Bonds are almost like a battery, and when you put them together, we're charging our battery, and we break them, we release all of our energy all at once. But breaking and making them always requires energy because they are stored energy. Alright, so let's get into our photosynthesis, and hopefully some of that background information can help us when we're talking about this. So photosynthesis is the process which takes sunlight and changes it into sugars. So this, to break down our word photosynthesis, I think sometimes that helps. Photo means light and synthesis means to build. So if we are struggling to remember our definition and we can remember photo means light, it's the process which takes sunlight, and then what are we doing? We're building. Our synthesis is build, so we're building sugars. This occurs in the chloroplast of the cell, which has chlorophyll. So when we look at our plant cell diagram, we have a lot of different organelles within our cell. So on the outside we have our lipids, lipid bilayer. We have our nucleus, which has all our DNA in it. We have some ribosomes, which are proteins. We have a vacuole, which is almost like where all our trash goes. Our mitochondria are a powerhouse of the cell. And then we have these things called chloroplasts. And they contain chlorophyll, which is where all photosynthesis takes place in each plant cell. We have an overall reaction. If this does look familiar to the one we just showed, our overall reaction is 6 carbon dioxide, or a CO2, plus 6 water, or H2O, go to make, with sunlight, sugar, C6H12O6, and oxygen. So I want you guys to write this down. It's an important equation that we're going to be trying to track and follow through all the way. So, and then also another important note is that we're going to need a lot of energy to break our CO2 and our H2O. So we need to learn where we get that energy from, which is in the form of light. But before we get there, another important thing before we get started, just to kind of help you guys when we get to these complicated steps. We have different electron carrying molecules. So some molecules work like batteries for energy. So these molecules will take the electrons and the energy from one step of the process to another and help move them, because it's difficult just to move one single electron or one little bit of energy. But if we can create a new bond that's easily breakable, we can take this molecule over to the other side and then it can be used there. So the important, really most important one I would say is this ADP and ATP. So ATP is our energy carrying molecule. It's incredibly important. When we see this, we think energy. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. So when we look at this, there's a little A. That's this sugar molecule is an A. And then 1, 2, 3 P's is for phosphate. So triphosphate means 3 phosphate molecules. And then if we want to, we can remove a phosphate and it releases our energy. And then we have adenosine diphosphate. So we go from ATP, tri, to ADP when we lose a phosphate group and it releases energy. So now our battery is empty and we need to get more energy in so that we can carry it somewhere else. So we have to put energy in and a phosphate group, and then it can get carried wherever very easily as ATP. Another one that works very, very similarly is NADP plus and NADPH. So if we're adding an H, we will remove our plus, and again, it's another battery molecule. So by adding electrons or elements to each molecule, it becomes fully charged. Now we can move around our battery a lot easier than if we wanted to just use electricity. But when we talk about our energy to break down each one of these molecules, we need a lot of it. And luckily we have the sun. Our sunlight is energy. And it has different rays, rays of different length. So when we talk about our light, there are different wavelengths, different lengths that have different amounts of energy. So when our lower levels are radio waves, so when we have our radio on and we're hearing some things, that's our radio. If we place something in the microwave, that's these length of waves. Then we have infrared radiation, which is the heat that is given off by an object, and then visible light. So there's a very small part of it, which is what we can actually see with our eyes, and that is visible light. We can see red is a shorter wavelength than blue and violet. So blue actually has more energy than our red. And then we have ultraviolet and then x-rays. Like if we go to the doctor, we get an x-ray to see our bones. And one more thing about this ultraviolet, or it's also called UV radiation. This is the radiation from the sun that will burn your skin. So when we're outside working all day, that is the radiation or the energy we have to be careful of. But our light has all this different kinds of energy, and this energy can be used for lots of different things. For photosynthesis, it is used to break down some molecules. But each color of light has a different wavelength. Yep, we talked about that. Oh, another important thing is that the color we actually see with our eyes is the color that is reflected, not absorbed. So what that means is when we look at black, for example, the color black, that means that every single color is being absorbed, so we don't see any of them. But it's the opposite for white. When we look at the color white, everything is being reflected. So we're actually seeing every single one of these. When we talk about plants, we often think of green plants. That is because that the chloroplast can absorb every kind of light but green. It actually reflects the green rather than absorbing it. So kind of an interesting thing to think about when we talk about light. But we have two main steps of our photosynthesis. We have our light-dependent reactions, which are named photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. I'm sorry that is confusing. They were named in the order that they were discovered and not the order that they actually go in our process. But that is their names. And then in this part, our sunlight will split our water to make hydrogen protons, H+, oxygen, and then some ATP and NAD. This should say pH, NADPH. So really, our sunlight's breaking water and it's making protons, oxygen, and energy molecules. Then in our light-independent reactions, we have, which are also known as the Calvin cycle, we have our carbon dioxide, which is changed to sugar. So thinking back to our overall equation, we took carbon dioxide and we took water and we made oxygen and we made sugar. So we have all of our main reactants, but let's see a little bit how they are used. So this is a really, really important table, I think, to understand each process and how each thing is going through and for us to follow our overall reaction. So I have our overall reaction at the bottom. Water, carbon dioxide, sunlight makes oxygen and our glucose. So when we look at our water and sunlight, we're making our ATP, our NADPH, half of an O2 because each water molecule only has one oxygen, but oxygen comes in pairs, so that's a little bit finicky, but oxygen and 2 protons, or H pluses. And then in our light-independent reactions, we're using our ATP and our NADH, which we just made, plus our CO2 to make our glucose. So when we think about it, in our first step, our light-dependent, we're making this energy, but then we're using this energy right away in our second step. So in our overall, it does not get seen. One last thing I want to talk about for today is the structure of our chloroplast. So we have thylakoids, which are a stack of membranes, and this is where photosystem 2 occurs. Our photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 are parts of our light-dependent reactions. And then we have the stroma, which is the liquid inside, and this is where photosystem 1 is. So we're going to learn about the very specific steps of how each of these work, but I think it helps to understand the chloroplast as a whole. So our thylakoid is right in here, and it even says light reactions. It's a little blurry. And then our stroma is the liquid or water-like fluid on the outside. So everything in photosystem 2 is here. Photosystem 1 is out in this space. And then this other part is our Calvin cycle. But I would like to stop there. Hopefully that is clear and a good introduction before we continue to talk about photosynthesis more. Thanks.